the whole thing about habits is it's the environment influencing you. So if you can change the environment, you can change the influence on yourself once you understand what that influence is. You want to set up your environment so that there is no friction stopping you from doing the behavior. And when you want to break a habit, you want to add friction. So you want to make it as easy as possible for yourself. So if you want to do exercise in the morning, getting all your exercise stuff out the night before. That's definitely a good idea to try and make it rewarding, but it needs to be rewarding at that time. So it's not at the end of the day, I say, oh, did I do that thing today? Yes, I did. Now I get whatever my reward is. It's about trying to make the behavior as rewarding as possible in the moment.
Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing Show. I'm Indy Dissanayake, host of the Mental Wellbeing Show and provisional psychologist. In today's episode, we have a really practical discussion on all things making and breaking habits. We have joining us Dr. Pippa Lally, a senior lecturer at the University of Surrey and co-director of the Habit Application and Theory Research Group. You may have actually come across Pippa's work in James Clear's Atomic Habits, and in fact that's where I first came across Pippa's research, as she's published one of the most widely cited studies on habit application and one of the only studies looking at the age-old question of how long does it take to make a habit. So in today's discussion, we do dive into the answers behind how long it takes to make a habit. Hint, it's not 21 days. We also dive into some real practical strategies on how you can build better habits in your life using tools like point of decision prompts and self-monitoring. And Pippa also walks us through some of the principles behind breaking bad habits, using an example of a habit that I'm trying to break in my own life, which is eating too much chocolate. Now, today's episode has some overlap with a previous episode I did with Dr. Ben Gardner, who is also a habit researcher. But that episode is a lot more on the theory of habits. So if you'd like to learn more about the background theory of habits, I suggest you check that episode, which I'll link below. Whereas today's discussion with Pippa is a lot more on the practical strategies to make and break habits in your life. So without further ado, let's move to today's discussion on making and breaking habits with Dr. Pippa Lally. Dr. Pippa Lally, welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here to dive into all things habit change. We're going to be discussing a lot about how to build desirable habits and how to break some of the more undesirable habits we might have. But before we do dive into that, I thought it makes sense to kind of conceptualize and frame the conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about what a habit is and what makes a behavior habitual?
So there are different definitions of habits, and different people say different things. The crucial part of a habit is that there is a mental association in your brain between a situation or a cue, we sometimes call it, and an action or a behavior. Or it could be between a situation and a thought. But it's that you encounter a situation and that triggers that association in memory, which usually leads to an impulse. If it's a behavior that we're talking about, that leads to an impulse to perform that behavior. And this can happen outside of our awareness, it can happen unconsciously. And so if nothing else stops us, if we don't intentionally stop ourselves or nothing else stops us, we will often perform that behavior without having made a conscious decision in the moment that we want to do that. So some people talk about it as it's a process. Some people talk about it as the habit is the mental association. What is important is that the behavior is not the habit. The behavior is the behavior. It can be a habitual behavior that has arisen because of the habit process, but the behavior itself isn't the habit, because it's important that we distinguish between the two, because behaviors can happen for lots of other reasons as well as because there is a habit.
Right. So is a habit then more of the impulse that causes the behavior? Is that the distinction?
Yeah, the habit is the process that leads to that impulse that then leads to that behavior.
Okay, right. And coming across like a lot of your research, it seems this concept of automaticity is very important. Can you run us through what that is and how that kind of plays a role in the habit process?
Yeah, so automaticity is when we do something um, very fast, often outside of awareness, without intention in the moment. Um, and automaticity is a key feature of habits, but there are also other processes that can lead to automaticity. So a habit has automaticity by virtue of the fact that you have repeated a behavior in the same situation, and that repetition has led to that mental association between the situation and the action. Whereas there are other situations where things might happen automatically for other reasons.
So if we look at it like as an example, maybe an example of, I think when I wake up in the morning, in my bed in that particular room, I have, this reaction almost to kind of reach for my phone and start scrolling through my phone. So what is the habit there? Is it the reaching for my phone, or is it the process that leads to it? Just so I can be entirely clear.
Yeah, so the habit is the fact that you have a mental association between that setting and that behavior. So being in your bedroom, waking up in the morning and reaching for your phone. That's that's the mental association that you have, and that leads to the behavior. So the process of you having that mental association and then that leading to the behavior, that's the habit. And the actual doing it, that's the habitual behavior. So the actually scrolling is the habitual behavior. But if your phone wasn't there one morning, if someone had come in the night and stolen your phone away, you wouldn't be able to perform the habitual behavior because your phone wouldn't be there. But that doesn't mean you don't still have the habit. It's just that you can't enact it because something has changed in the setting.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. So I know a lot of people listening, a lot of students kind of emailed in saying, it'd be great to know, how do I go about building habits? I have all these things I want to change. I want to exercise more. I want to eat healthy. I want to get into these habitual behaviors. So what are some of the kind of key principles of habit formation that people can kind of take away?
So the key thing is to make very specific plans. So we often say, I want to eat more healthy, I want to do more exercise, but these are kind of big, broad goals that we have in our lives. They don't tell us what to do and when to do it. So if you want to form a habit, you've got to firstly identify the actual behavior you're going to do and when you are going to do it, and make a very specific plan. You've then got to try and set up your life so that that's possible, so that in that setting you have everything you need. So saying, even if I made a very specific plan that I am going to go running at 8 o'clock in the morning, if at 8 o'clock in the morning I'm actually nowhere near my running shoes and my running clothes, and actually I'm in a lecture, I can't go running then, that's ridiculous. So it's thinking through your life, working out where things fit, then making a commitment to yourself that you're going to do that. Ideally, maybe setting up some sort of monitoring system so you can check at the end of each day, did I do it? Maybe setting a reminder to remind yourself to do it. And then it is just as simple as, and it sounds simple, and obviously it often isn't when life gets in the way, but in terms of the habit process, it is as simple as repeating that behavior over and over and over and over again until you form that association. So then at 8 o'clock one morning, at 8 o'clock, I just put my shoes on and go for a run. I don't have to think, do I want to? What's the weather like? Oh, it's going to hurt. Oh, actually, maybe I should be writing an essay at that time. Any other things. I just get up and do it because it's the thing I always do. And then that's something that you're doing and it has all the positive outcomes that you wanted from that behavior. Exercise is a slightly complicated example because no one is suggesting that I go for a whole run and then I get back and be like, oh, I went for a run. I didn't even notice. Like, that's obviously a ridiculous suggestion. But there is a difference between the instigation of a behavior and the execution of it. So Ben Gardner came up with this distinction, and Alison Phillips, they work together, where when we're talking about exercise, we can talk about the instigation, so the getting out of the front door to go on a run, and then actually what I do on my run. Now, either part of those things could be habitual, or both, or neither. So getting out of the door could be my habit. I have an instigation habit for going for a run. That doesn't mean I have to go on exactly the same run for the same length of time at the same speed every time. And that isn't what we would want in terms of physical activity. We would want people to be building up over time as they get fitter and stronger. But you can have an instigation for getting out, and then your execution of the behaviour is different each time. It could be that it's the other way round, and that I don't have an instigation habit. I have to make myself think it's different every time, it's different every week. I have to make myself get out the door intentionally, but then I have a standard route I always run, and I execute it habitually. So it's important, for some behaviours, it's important to think about that difference. For something like having a sip of water, there isn't really a useful distinction between the beginning of having a sip of water and then the actually having it. But for something like exercise, it's important to think about that difference.
So from what you're saying, then particularly with the instigation kind of component, it sounds like really setting up your environment so that you are ready to kind of perform that desired behavior is really important.
Yes. And Wendy Wood, who's a brilliant professor in the States, talks about friction. So she uses this term friction. So you want to set up your environment so that there is no friction stopping you from doing the behavior. And when you want to break a habit, you want to add friction. So you want to make it as easy as possible for yourself. So if you want to exercise in the morning, getting all your exercise stuff out the night before. If you want to eat fruit, make sure you've got fruit. You can't eat something that's not there. Make sure it's there in your environment. Make sure you pack it. Setting it up to make it easy for you to do the things you want to do. So it requires a bit of thought, a bit of planning ahead of time. But you can even make habits for the preparing part, if you see what I mean. So, you have a habit of buying apples when you're in the supermarket, so that then you can have a habit of eating apples in the home. So you can set up kind of lots of habits that work together to enable you to achieve your larger goals of a healthy life or studying well or whatever it is that you want to work towards.
And in terms of setting up those habits, Pippa, one of the kind of key learnings that I had reading through your papers was the importance of event-based cues rather than time. So instead of like going for a run at 8 o'clock in the morning, going for a run after breakfast. Can you talk us through like the importance of that distinction?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one in that I was quite convinced that was the case, because if you have a time-based cue, if I say I'm going to do something at 10 o'clock, I need to monitor what time it is in order to be like, oh, it's 10 o'clock, now it's time for me to do the thing. Or I need to have a reminder, but then in fact, the reminder is the cue, not the time. But a colleague of mine, Keller, set up a study specifically to test whether saying to people, you need to choose an event as your cue, or saying to people, you need to set a time as your cue, made a difference. And in his study, he didn't show that it made a difference. Now, that was one study. We need to replicate it. My suspicion is that even when people make a time-based cue, they know what happens in their life at that time. So in effect, it is an event. If you say 9 o'clock, they know usually where they are at 9 o'clock, and actually it's the setting. But that's just my hypothesis. I don't know. But what's interesting from what he did was, in terms of the advice you give to people in that study, it didn't seem to matter. I would still personally, if I was trying to make a habit, I would use an event as my cue. I would think, what is the setting in which I'm then going to do this? Because that helps me to also think about the environment and setting that up. Because if it's just a time, what if at that time I'm in the wrong place and haven't got the right stuff? Whereas if I say after breakfast when I'm at home, I know what's in that setting. I know what's there, what's available to me, and so on.
And it feels like we have more control over the event-based cue, right? If we're trying to exercise like after work or go for a run after work, and you go for a run at 5 p.m, well, work might not finish till 5:15 p.m, right? There are things outside of our control as well in terms of time.
And for most habits, it doesn't matter what time you do it. It matters that you do it. Now, there may be some habits, for example, perhaps taking some forms of medication or something, where it is really important that it is done at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because it's very important for whatever reason. So obviously there are settings where time is necessary as the cue. But then still I would think about, well, where are you going to be at that time? And what do you need to set up around you in order that you would always have the medication there?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And in terms of habit formation as well, what's the role of sleep and stress? Because just anecdotally, in terms of habits, I'm trying to make a daily occurrence, habitual behaviors like meditate, journal. I find that particularly when I'm sleep deprived, it's a lot harder for me to make things that aren't already a habit and to do them on that day. It just, whether it's less willpower or less executive functioning, I'm not sure. But is there a role between sleep and stress and the habit formation phase where you're trying to make a behavior a habit?
Yeah, so we don't really know about stress. There is some suggestion that being stressed when you're forming a habit could be a good thing. I think there's a suggestion from the animal literature that could help form those associations quicker. But obviously that's not very useful because we don't want to be stressing people out while they're forming habits. Like that's not a useful thing in humans. We don't want to do that. In terms of, yes, always, when in any behavior change situation, this is not specific to trying to form habits. Whenever you are trying to do something new, it's really hard when you are stressed, when you are sleep deprived. As you say, you don't have the resources to focus on these things, to make yourself do things. And that's why habits are so good once they are formed, because once they're formed, they are the default. So even when you are stressed, you mostly will do your habits. Exercise possibly slightly differently because it still does take energy, so you might consciously override your habits. But definitely for for something simple like food choice, if you have a really strong habit for eating a healthy lunch and then you're really stressing about your essay, you will probably continue to still eat your healthy lunches because it's actually easier than thinking about an alternative. You just continue with your habits, you do what you always do, it continues. So that's why habits are so brilliant once they're formed. But you've got to go through the forming part in order to do that, which is why for students, I would always recommend when you first get to university, when, yes, it is stressful when you first get to university because you've got to meet new people and work out your new environment, but that's the perfect time to start forming great new habits because you've lost your old habits anyway because your environment is completely different. So whether you choose to or not, you are going to be forming new habits. Whether you think that through or not, you just are by virtue of you are going to do something and then you're going to do it again and then you're going to do it again and it's going to become a habit. So at that point, thinking through, right, what habits do I actually want to form now that are going to then help me later on when it gets to exam time, when my dissertation is due in, when everything gets a bit stressful at that point. If you formed those healthy habits at the beginning, those are then going to see you through. So one healthy habit to try and develop is definitely getting enough sleep, getting to bed at a sensible time, having a routine about when you go to bed, when you wake up. That has a huge impact on people's health and a massive impact. I never realized this until a while ago when I was talking to some students about habits, but the association between sleep and grade outcomes is huge. And I was just like, well, that's brilliant. Like, of all the things I could do in my life, sleep is something I can do. So, like, go to sleep, you'll get better grades, and that helps you study. So, that's a great habit to try and get into before the stress, really hits.
So is it fair to say then off that point that if you want to change other habits and build other habits, it makes sense to get into a habit of better sleep if that's not already something that you're doing to help the other habit formation?
I'd say it's definitely not a bad idea.
Very relevant one for the uni student population listening. And you mentioned something there as well about like when you start university, it's a perfect opportunity, right? And I think in some of your papers you refer to big changes in your life as a window of opportunity because the context where you have those habits is now changed, right? Can you talk us through, a little bit more about the importance of that if you're changing a job, changing university, moving house, why those changes are opportunities?
Yeah, so Basper Plunken calls this habit discontinuity, which is just him putting a big word on it. But habits are associations between situations and actions. So if those situations disappear, you're not in those situations anymore. You don't have the habits still exist in your brain, but they are not affecting your life because you're no longer in that situation. So you encounter a whole load of new situations, you are going to perform behaviours in those situations. And so we usually think about, we don't worry so much about what we do once because we think, well, it was only once. But doing something once often leads to doing it twice, which often leads to doing it 3 times. And that's when you start getting into this. It's like accidentally digging a, making a path. You walk that way again, you walk that way again, and you end up with a path through, your field. And if we don't make a choice about what that is, if on my first day of university, I go for a burger, fine, it was the first day of university. But then the next day I go, oh, I wonder what I'm going to have for lunch. Well, that burger was nice. I'll go and have a burger again. Fine. Third, it's very easy to develop those habits that you might then, look back on and be like, oh, that wasn't a great habit to have developed. Ideally, I would have, made a different choice. And yeah, so it's just when you have big life changes, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at what behaviours you were doing, which ones you want to form. I had a great habit there. I want to have the same habit again, but I'm going to have to think about what my new cue is going to be because the old one has gone. Or I had this terrible habit. Great, that one's gone. Let's not form it again in the new setting. And starting at university is a very good example because it's such a different environment from when you're living at home with your parents. Usually that's where people have come from, not always. So much has changed. So starting a new job, kind of part of your life has changed, but not all of it necessarily, because if you haven't relocated for that job, your home life is probably still similar. But it's still an opportunity to think about the habits around, your habits of commuting, your habits of, what lunch you have at work and those things.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think you referred to something there about starting with having a burger once, and it becomes easier to do those behaviors twice and then 3 times. And one of the graphs I saw in your paper is like habit formation is this kind of asymptote. So it's kind of like a steeper, at the start, and then it kind of flattens out on the dimension of automaticity, right? And so that to me kind of highlights that those first instances have a comparatively larger impact on habit formation than the latter ones.
Yeah, so the increase with each repetition, the increase in automaticity with each repetition is bigger at the beginning. Once you've done something 3,000 times, the 3,001st time doesn't make any, you get to a point where it is as automatic as it's ever going to be. And the repetitions aren't increasing that. But initially, they're making a big difference. And I would sometimes I think about, if I have never done something, it can't possibly become a habit. As soon as I've done it once, it's not a habit yet, but it's so much easier to do something the second time when you've done it the first time. I used to, when I worked in London, I used to commute into London on the train. So I'd get the train from the overland train. And once I got to London, there were ways for me to get from the station to my office, but I always walked. So I didn't know where the bus was or how I would get a bus or a tube or anything. So it wasn't an option in my head because I didn't know how to do it. Then I got pregnant, and towards the end of my pregnancy couldn't walk. So then I learned. So then I knew where the buses were. So then that made that forever after that was always an option in my brain. It always logically was an option, but it was an option in my brain because I'd done it. I'd done it a few times towards the end of my pregnancy. Whereas if you never ever do it, it makes it easier.
So then on that point, right, if let's say you're trying to build a good behavior, good in quotation marks, as a habit, right? You're trying to intentionally make something a habit. So given that those first instances kind of have a comparatively larger bearing on making it a habit than the 3001st, instance, as you said, are there strategies that people can use to kind of almost like reward those first few instances when it's really effortful and really hard to make it more enticing to do it again?
So from the neuropsychology literature, we know that if things are more rewarding, literally as you do them, that speeds the habit formation process. So that's definitely a good idea to try and make it rewarding, but it needs to be rewarding at that time. So it's not at the end of the day I say, oh, did I do that thing today? Yes, I did. Now I get whatever my reward is. It's about trying to make the behavior as rewarding as possible in the moment, which a lot is about choosing what the behavior is. So if I absolutely hate running, have always hated running, believe I will always hate running, trying to form a running habit seems like a pretty bad idea. Not that running isn't really good for you, but there are other forms of exercise that you might enjoy more, that it would be more sensible to try and form a habit for. Because if you enjoy it in the moment, that will help. And that's why we talk about building up with exercise, because if you've never run and you try and go and run 5k, it's going to hurt and it's going to be very painful. It's definitely not going to be rewarding. Whereas when you build up at a sensible pace over time, it feels doable, you feel like you've achieved something, and then you can gradually build up. But there are other things you can do to make things rewarding. So with exercise, we often say, well, think about where you would like to exercise. If you're going to exercise, are you the kind of person that if you're going to do a run, try and form a running habit because you think running might be okay? Do you like running on a treadmill in a gym? Do you like running around the roads of your town? Do you like running in the fields? Do you like running on the beach? Should you have a beach? Whatever it is, where makes you most happy? Which do you find most enjoyable? Well, do that. Don't do something in a place that you don't feel safe or you don't like. Do you like listening to music? Do you like listening to podcasts? Do you like listening to an audiobook? Do you like the quiet and listening to nature? Do you like going with a friend and having a chat while you run? Can you have the benefit of running, but it's also a social time at the same? So thinking through how to make things, not just where could this fit in my life and where practically can I put it, also how can I choose something that I'm going to enjoy, that is going to enhance my life in the moment that I do it, as well as because I think it has these health benefits, down the line. If you hate apples, don't eat apples. Eat some other fruit. So yeah, the more rewarding something is, definitely the better. And the more you have chosen it yourself and you really want to do it and you believe in the benefits of it, for your life, then you're going to have much more success if as a researcher I come along and say, well, it would be jolly good for you to do whatever, and you don't want to do it. It's never going to work. It's not going to happen. And if you externally reward people, even if I came along and said, I'm going to pay you every time you go for a run, it's not going to form a habit, because you're only doing it because I'm paying you. And unless I am rich enough to pay you for the rest of your life every time you go for a run, seems unlikely, the behavior is not going to stick.
Okay, so I've got to be careful with external rewards. What if with the external rewards, because obviously there are some habits that we have to do which perhaps aren't intrinsically enjoyable in the moment. Like, for example, I am trying to meditate and I'm trying to find more enjoyable ones. But if I'm honest, at this point in time, meditating daily before I go to bed is very much a chore, right? Is it okay to reward yourself on more of like a variable rather than every single time kind of ratio, so that you don't form the really concrete association of I'm just doing it for the reward?
Yeah, so the animal literature suggests that unpredictable and variable rewards lead to associations forming quicker. We haven't really tested it out in humans. We haven't sort of done an experiment where we've gone, right, these people are going to be rewarded this amount and these people are going to be rewarded this amount in this way. And it's quite difficult if you're doing it to yourself, because then how are you going to not know the reward schedule? Maybe you could get someone else.
Yeah.
Because otherwise there is this association. Well, when I do it on Friday, I'm going to get a reward. But I guess it's about thinking about, why are you meditating? Do you believe in why you're doing it? Do you genuinely believe there's some benefit, or has someone told you should meditate? Like, what is for most people I know who meditate, they get something out of it. They feel better, or they sleep better, or so I agree. I hate meditating. My brain is, I'm sure it would be good for me, but it's not my nature to sit and be still. So yes, and maybe it would be good for me, but I equally would find it hard to form a habit of doing it, because my brain is a bit rah, and I would just have thoughts and want to write them down all the time, like, because So I think it's about why you're doing it and whether you can make it more enjoyable in the moment, ideally.
So I'd like to stay with the topic of reward, value, and habits. And so on this notion, right, if you can't make something intrinsically enjoyable, you mentioned something about asking yourself why you're doing it. So does it help to connect with the values of the behavior? If you're still doing it as a means to an end, if that end is more valuable on your own personal values, will that help to make it a habit?
I think so. There is some research on the association between habit and identity. So if the behaviour isn't enjoyable in itself, but it's an important part of your identity. So I'm drinking this horrible tasting smoothie, which is disgusting and I don't enjoy drinking it, but I identify as a healthy person that consumes healthy things, and so it has that benefit. So that kind of is intrinsically rewarding, because although it's not rewarding in the kind of physical sense, it's rewarding because it fits with my identity of who I am as a person. So if you value the outcome at the end and you can try and make sure that in the moment you're focused on that outcome, then that might help. But we do need to kind of do some more research on that to really kind of really lock that down and see if that can work. I mean, the other thing is that things do often become more rewarding as you do them. So exercise becomes more rewarding as you do it more. As you get fitter, it hurts less, and you get more endorphins, and you enjoy actually doing the exercise. Food, there's lots of research that, with children who don't like the flavour of something, if you give them a little bit every day, as they taste it more, they begin to like it more. So that's good. That helps. It complicates it in a research sense. It complicates the situation, because you can't say this behavior is this amount rewarding, because the rewarding amount changes. But it's kind of good. It's good to motivate people, because so you're not only saying to people, well, if you stick with it, then it will get easier for you to do it every time, because it will become more habitual. But not only that, you are likely to start enjoying it more every time. So initially you've got to put in that, that hard graft, like with everything in life, nothing's easy. You've got to put in that, kind of will yourself to do it, motivate yourself to do it. And then you get those rewards down the line. But still thinking, choosing the thing that you are going to enjoy the most is going to really, really help.
And on that notion of willing yourself to do it, so one key takeaway from my earlier conversation with Ben was that, willpower kind of matters more at the start, but as you go on, things become more automatic and become easier in that sense, in the sense that you don't need to consciously motivate yourself to do things. You can default to your habits almost.
Yeah, but initially it takes effort to do something new, to try, to try to remember, simply just remembering to do things is hard. We all have really busy lives. There's a lot going on. It's very easy to be like, oh yeah, I'll do that tomorrow. And then you get to the end of tomorrow and it hasn't happened because, lots of other things have got in the way. And so we sometimes talk about having kind of backup habits or backup plans. So that if something happens to stop you doing the habit that you're trying to form, you kind of have a secondary habit that kind of can kick in. So, if I plan to always exercise first thing in the morning, but then one morning I can't because, I don't know, my child is sick and I need to look after them, I can have a backup plan, which is that there's another slot in the day where that fits. That if I don't do it the first slot, it goes in the second slot. It doesn't really work with meditating at bedtime, because then you're asleep.
So, Pippa, when I actually first came across your research, it was when I was looking for some peer-reviewed work on how long it takes to form a habit, because everyone seems to have an opinion on it. The belief growing up was that it takes 21 days to form a habit. I don't actually know where that came from. I'm sure you have some insight there, but can you shed some light as to the length of time it takes to form a habit? And obviously there's variability there.
So Ben did some research on the 21-day thing, because he was like, this is really annoying. Why does everybody say it's 21 days? And we think he's tracked it back to a plastic surgeon who said that it takes his patients 21 days to get used to a new limb or something, or a lost limb, or some change in their body, which obviously is completely different to forming a habit. So it's kind of 21-day thing. So this was the question I had when I started my PhD many moons ago, and we wanted to know how long it takes to form a habit. So we got a bunch of students and said to them, right, you choose an eating activity or drinking behaviour that you want to change, that you're motivated to change, and then I'd like you to go away and try and we got them to choose something that they could do every day and once a day, because we wanted that to be consistent, because obviously if some people were doing something 10 times a day and other people twice a week, it wouldn't. So it had to be something they did every day and once a day. So we made them choose a cue. So the cues were all getting up, going to bed, or meal times, because those are the things that happen, weekdays, weekends, they happen consistently. So those were all their cues. And then they chose their behaviour. So they said, I will have a drink of water after breakfast, or I will do 5 sit-ups before I go to bed, or whatever it is. And then every day for 12 weeks, they tried to do that. And I then asked them to report. They were supposed to log on every day, fill in a self-report measure of how automatically they were doing that behaviour, and also tell me whether they had done it the day before. If they'd missed a few days, they still did the automaticity measure, but they could tell me retrospectively 3 days back whether they had done the behaviour. So then for each person, we could draw a graph of day of the study along the bottom and automaticity score up the top. And that's where we got these asymptotic curves where it goes up. Now, that wasn't for everybody. We found the people that worked for, and we kind of threw out everybody else, and said those people haven't formed habits for whatever reason. Often it was because they weren't performing the behaviour consistently enough, and so it just didn't seem to have worked for them. So for the people who did have the asymptotic curves, which was 39 people, so this is a very small study, but for those people, the average time it took from the beginning until they reached that plateau at the top, so automaticity goes up and plateaus, their time from the beginning to that plateau, so from them starting to it becoming as automatic as we believe it's ever going to be, the average was 66 days. But the range was 18 to 254. Now, the study didn't go 254 days, but because this is about a modelled statistical curve, we could say 254 days is the modelled time for that person. So the range was huge. So we deliberately did not write 66 days in the abstract of that paper, because we knew people were going to jump on it, and that was not our message. Our message was, it seems to be an asymptotic curve. This seems to work as a way to look at habit formation. The range is huge. We need to do more research to understand why the range is huge, what predicts how long it takes to form a habit. Of course, the media found the number 66 days. And now if you Google how long does it take to form a habit, you get 66 days, which is kind of great for me because it's a really highly cited paper and lots of people like you want to talk to me. But the researcher part of me is like, no, stop it. It's not 66 days. So yeah, it basically the answer is it's hugely variable. It's definitely very rarely 21 days. There's a few people that it might be for very likely for kind of very the simpler behaviours. It might be possible. But so there have been a couple of other studies now that have taken a similar approach to me, and they're getting similar-ish numbers, kind of from 50 up to kind of 100, some 150. But they're not getting something completely different. But then there are other people that say, well, we need to measure habit differently, or, it's a habit sooner than it reaches its plateau. You could say it's a habit once it gets to a certain score. So the answer is it's very difficult to know, and it depends on the situation, and it depends on what's going on. What's important to tell people when they want to form habits is it can take a while, and you do have to maintain your motivation until it feels automatic. You're the only one that's going to know when it feels like you're doing it automatically without having to think about it and do planning and so on. And it might take a good while. So don't get to 21 days and then be like, oh, well, it doesn't feel automatic. The whole thing's failed. I'm giving up. Because that's what we don't want. We don't want to sell people a false message that then means they're demotivated when it doesn't kind of work in exactly the way they think it's going to.
Well, no, I can imagine your frustration, because It feels like in psychology that everything is just grey, but as soon as the media or those in pop psych or self-help space get a hold of something, it becomes very black and white. So
Yeah. Yeah, everybody likes a simple answer, and that's fine. I like a simple answer too. It's just usually there isn't one.
yeah. You mentioned a couple of other studies, because I've been scouring the literature for this, and I haven't come across the other studies looking at length of time it takes to form a habit. So, do you know off the top of your head the names or even author names?
So that Jan Keller did the study where I talked about where he asked people to do a time-based or an event-based cue. So that was a similar approach. People did it and they tracked. And then I'm gonna get her name right. The surname is Fournier, I think. Is
Fournier. Okay.
She did some things on. I think it's Marion Fournier. Did a couple of studies looking at doing a similar thing. She was looking at whether morning or evening habits form quicker, which was quite interesting.
Okay, I'll have a look. I'll link them in the show notes for those keen, and I'll have a look myself because that'll be interesting to see. Yeah. Also, in terms of habit formation, the notion of, I think it was point of decision prompts came up, which is quite interesting. I think a useful tool, perhaps for some people listening, to use to make things, habitual, to make behaviors habitual. Can you run us through what point of decision prompts are?
A point of decision prompt doesn't really work if you're thinking about sort of adding physical activity that could be added at any point in your day, because there isn't kind of one point of decision. If it's something like, what do I buy? I'm in the shop and I could buy an apple or I could buy a chocolate bar. There could be some sort of prompt to try and remind me that I really want to buy apples and I really don't want to buy chocolate bars. So I think it's about a reminder kind of in the moment that there is a decision to be made, if for those kinds of situations. So yeah, can be useful, just kind of depends what behaviors people are trying to.
So I was thinking about how I could apply this in my own life. Lately, I've been eating too much cake and chocolates, and it's reflecting in my waistline a little bit. In the kitchen, I don't live alone, so unfortunately I don't have complete control over the food in my environment. But if I put like a banana or something appetizing but healthier next to the junk food, or if I put even like a motivational quote or something, in the kitchen where the junk food is, are those theoretically smart ways to go about point of decision prompts?
Yeah, so the point is, if you are habitually eating those behaviors, so if you walk into the kitchen and you grab the chocolate bar and you walk out and you eat it, and it isn't a conscious kind of, oh, do I want to eat a chocolate bar or not, then putting something to remind you, you didn't want to eat that chocolate bar, helps you break the habit process. What you then do at that point is then about your motivation. So it's then, okay, you've broken, you can't say you're doing it because it's a habit. At that point, you're making a conscious choice. Do I want to eat the chocolate bar or do I want to eat the banana? And you're right, the best way to break a habit would be if the food just wasn't there. Because if it's not there, you can't eat it. But if you don't have control over that, I mean, one thing you can do is see if you can change the setup of the kitchen. So put those foods not where they used to be, because that equally would break the habit, because you wouldn't be able to walk in and grab it without thinking. You'd have to walk in and go, you'd try to grab it and then you'd be, oh, the chocolate bar's not there. And then you'd have to search for the chocolate bar, which is, so in the same way that having, a sign saying don't forget, it would break the habit process. And then again, it's the conscious motivation that's then going to control which you have. And hopefully, if on enough occasions you choose the banana and you eat the banana instead of the chocolate, at some point the banana eating habit should overrule the chocolate eating habit. But we don't know how long that takes. It's likely to be longer than forming a new habit, because not only do you need this habit, it's got to be stronger than the other one, because you need your impulse to eat the banana to be stronger than your impulse to eat the chocolate. And the other thing is that probably the chocolate is more intrinsically rewarding in the moment. which means you're then fighting against that as well. So we need to do some more, for years people have been saying, well, just replace your chocolate with your banana or grapes or whatever. But in reality, we don't really know how we can help people to make that work, because, unhealthy food just releases all these, chemicals, and that's why it's so hard to not eat it when we're trying to. Which again is why it's better if you've never eaten chocolate, because if you've never eaten chocolate, you never would, you wouldn't have experienced any of that, and you wouldn't have those habits. But that ship has obviously sailed for most of us. So we now have to fight against, the situation that we are in.
I think I'm well past the 3001st instance of eating chocolate in my lifetime. So yeah. Are there other key principles though of breaking bad habits that people could use to implement?
Yeah. So you can either go at it from the cue or the behaviour. So what we were just talking about was kind of both, as in trying to change the cue, so trying to change the environment so it's different, but also making it impossible to do the behaviour. So the best way for a habit to not guide your behaviour, the best thing to do is avoid the cue. So the first thing you have to do is work out what your habits are. So you might know, I think I eat too much chocolate, which is, yes, that's a starting point. But then you've got to work out when you eat the chocolate. What is the cue? Is it an external cue? Just I'm walking through my kitchen, or I'm cooking dinner and I'll just have a bit of chocolate while I'm waiting. Is it bed? What is it? Or it could be an internal cue. So when I feel sad, when I feel worried, when I'm about to start to write an essay. So environmental and internal cues can cue you. So working out those cues first, and then seeing if there's any way of avoiding those cues. So if I usually buy an unhealthy bun on my way to work, well, can I go to work a different way so I don't pass the place that I buy the bun? Because that's the easiest way, but it's often not possible, because the cues are often things that are in our homes, in our lives, that we can't, people can be cues. And I'm not going to divorce my husband just because he's a cue to a bad habit. So thinking what the cues are, seeing if you can change them is the first thing. Then seeing if you can make the behaviour not possible. So if you can't change the cue, can you do something so the behaviour isn't possible? So very simple one is that if you bite your nails, this doesn't always work for men who might not want to have fancy nails, but if I have fancy nail varnish put on my nails, then I'm a lot less likely to bite them than if I don't have the fancy nail varnish. So doing something to make the behaviour not possible, removing the chocolate. You can't eat the chocolate, it's not there. So you can go either end. Or it's a matter of trying to substitute. So that's eating the banana instead of eating the chocolate, because it is easier to do something than to do nothing. So if you have a habit and you don't want to act in that way, finding a different way you can act is helpful. But the best thing to do is to create friction. Make it hard in the environment to do that behaviour, so that it's harder for yourself. Because the whole thing about habits is it's the environment influencing you. So if you can change the environment, you can change the influence on yourself once you understand what that influence is. Sometimes people keep a diary so that they can see when they did the behaviour and then say, right, what came first? What do I think was the thing that triggered me to do that?
I was actually going to ask, you mentioned something way back at the very start of our conversation about self-monitoring. So is this the value of self-monitoring, to become aware of what your habit loops are, what the cues are that actually precede the habit, and then you can, after having awareness, change it?
Yeah, so self-monitoring you can use for habit forming or habit breaking. So for habit forming, if you make a plan to do something, we need to use every tool that we have to help people can maintain that repetition. And it's very easy to forget things, to forget our plans. So if you have some form of self-monitoring and you remember to do the self-monitoring, that can help you look and go, oh yes, I did do it today. And also, people love ticks. It doesn't matter how old you are. People love sticker charts. People love ticks, some form of ticks, rewards, trophies, whatever. People love to see, oh yes, I'm doing that. I am working towards something. I am achieving this. And then if you haven't done it, you realize quickly you haven't done it, and you maybe adjust your plans, change your plans as necessary, rather than getting 2 weeks later and thinking, oh yeah, I was planning to do that thing, but I haven't done it. It's just each day monitoring. But yes, it's also a way of monitoring what bad habits you might have and thinking, oh, right, that's a bad habit. How am I going to change it? What happened before? How can I change the situation? And I think when you're a habit researcher, you spend a lot of time saying, habits are brilliant, they're wonderful, everybody should form habits. And once you've formed a habit, you'll keep doing it, and that's great. The habits are great, but they're not entirely magic, and people's lives do change and people do lose their habits. So I think it's good to take stock of your life, work out what habits you want, work out what habits you don't want, try and change them, and then have some sort of regular check-in. So once a month, maybe once every 2 months, have a reminder that says, check your habits, and just go, right, am I still doing all the things that I want to do and not doing the things I don't want to do? And do I need to make any adjustments? Has some cue disappeared? So I suddenly, oh, whoops, I've suddenly lost that piece of fruit I was eating because that cue has changed in my life. Just to, keep on top. So initially you probably need to self-monitor more frequently. And then as things become established, you could self-monitor more as a check-in every now and again to see how things are.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have like a little habit chart, which I'm doing the daily self-monitoring, but I have done more of a global review, every month or so. So that's really useful advice. Are there any kind of final tips that you wanted to impart upon listeners, particularly for those, who are wanting to build new habits or to break, habits that don't serve them as well?
So I really like Katy Milkman, who's a brilliant researcher. She has a really good book called How to Change, which is very accessible. She talks about temptation bundling, which is where she links something she does want to do with something she wants to do less in the moment. So in her study, what she did was when people went to the gym, they listened to an audiobook of the Hunger Games. But they were only allowed to listen to their audiobook of the Hunger Games when they were in the gym. So even though they might not have been looking forward to going to the gym because of the exercise, they were looking forward to going to the gym because they wanted to know what was going to happen in the Hunger Games. So in terms of how to make things rewarding in the moment, something like that. So locking something that you really enjoy doing, but might feel a bit guilty about doing at other times because it doesn't feel like it's beneficial for your long-term goals. But then you lock it to something that is beneficial for your long-term goals. It's a double win because you don't have to feel guilty about the kind of guilty pleasure thing, and you're getting it will help you to do the thing that's good for you. So another example I've heard her give before is she's only allowed to go to the kind of not so healthy eating place down the road that she likes to go to, but no, she shouldn't go to very often, when she's got to meet with a student that she doesn't really feel like she wants to meet with. That sounds horrible. I'm sure she loves meeting with her students. But if she's very busy, she's got to have a meeting. Then they go to that place, and so she's looking forward to it because of So there are probably we all have both those things in our lives. We have things that we'd like to do that we know we probably shouldn't do. They're not that good for us, but it wouldn't be disastrous if we did them every now and again. And then the things that we really should do, but we find hard to do because they're not so enjoyable. If you can link those together and have a very strict rule that you can only do those things together, then that's potentially one way of helping people to, do the things that are good for them.
Okay, that's really interesting. Temptation bundling. I'll have to have a think about how I can use that for my meditation habit. Maybe I can't eat chocolate while I meditate, maybe afterwards or something. But yeah.
Not too much chocolate.
No, not too much. That's right. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Pippa. This has been fantastic. Very applied conversation, lots of practical strategies. I really appreciate that.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And that was Making and Breaking Habits with Dr. Pippa Lally. I really enjoyed this discussion. It felt really practical, and I walk away knowing that there's a lot of strategies that I could apply to my life immediately. I think the biggest takeaway for me was the role of intrinsic motivation, and how if we can make things that we're not yet able to make a habit, or that on some level we know we need to make a habit, but it's not perhaps that intrinsically enjoyable, if we can modify them to make them more enjoyable, that goes a long way towards making it easier to build it as a habit. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and learnt a lot as well, and I would be super grateful if you were to comment below, as I do love hearing feedback on these discussions. That's all for today. Stay tuned for next week's episode with Dr. Lauren Lipner on all things therapeutic alliance in psychotherapy.